Welcome to Cut the Crop, keeping you in the know about everything you grow. Researchers, growers and other interesting folk delivering insights and information on topics ranging from agronomy to profitability. Brought to you by the Foundation for Arable Research.
Hello and welcome to Cut the Crop. I'm your host Anna Heslop, and today I'm talking to Diana Mathers, head of FAR's Environmental Research Team, and we're going to be talking about the findings of her long-term fluxmeter project. Welcome, Di.
Thank you, Anna. Great to be talking to you.
Let's start with a quick summary of how the fluxmeter project came about and what it involved, and probably a really good starting point, what is a fluxmeter?
Okay, so the fluxmeter project came about after FAR did an overseer review in 2013, and we realised that we didn't have any long-term actual data about nitrogen losses from the crop rotation. So we decided to put together a project to collect information about nitrogen losses from our arable and vegetable rotations. And we used fluxmeters for this. And a fluxmeter is really just a receptacle for collecting drainage water. They're made out of drainage pipe that just comes from places like Bunnings, and at the top of them they have a funnel with some filter material in it that collects the drainage water coming out of the soil profile from beneath the crop. And they're buried at about a metre underneath the crop, the surface of the soil there, and they collect the drainage water that comes down through that profile. And we set them up. We had 12 sites around New Zealand in 4 regions, and in each of our sites there were 12 flux meters installed, and they were installed in sets of 4, quite close to each other, but just to give us a little bit of randomization around collecting that data. And so the flux meters collect the drainage water, and when we know there's been a drainage event, the drainage water is pumped to the surface via a little tube, and then we collect it and measure the nitrogen and phosphorus concentrations in that water.
So you were looking at a number of different crops and rotations over time. It wasn't just what comes off a wheat crop this year.
That's correct. So the project ran over 7 years. So the flux meters were installed in 2014, and we collected our last set of data last year. And they were just collecting drainage from under that rotation. And we didn't ask the farmers to change the rotation. It was just as they planned it. And so across our 12 sites, we had arable crops and vegetable crops, and we had stock in their grazing phases. And one site up in Oakuni started as an arable site and then reverted into long-term pasture. So it kind of was a benchmark of what a long-term pasture site would be like. So a range of crops throughout that 6 years.
And so what did the results show? Are there any good or bad crops, or are there good and bad years?
The results showed us that everything is very variable. There are no good and bad crops. And so what we found, one of the crops that we had in our rotations was potatoes, and the losses that we found ranged from 2 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year, which is very low, up to about 200 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year, which is high. And so those differences relate to what the biophysical characteristics were for the site, so the soils, and also the climatic impact of what happened when that crop was in the ground, whether it was a wet or a dry year, and also the management practices that the farmers would have used for that crop. And I've used potatoes as an example, mainly because we had that as some data that we collected across a number of different crops, but that will apply to any crop in the rotation. No good or bad crops, but there can be good and bad years. And there can also be soils that are easier to manage than others. So free draining soils or sandy soils or stony soils, much more difficult to manage than a nice deep silt loam soil.
Was any farm consistently high or low with its leaching?
Some of the vegetable production systems were high, and the arable systems depended a lot on whether or not they were on their soil types. So some of them were consistently low, and others had more challenges. So you can't say there are good or bad farms either. They do vary, and sometimes if you get a great big rainfall event, everything goes out of your soil, you lose everything, and that's just an act of God sort of situation.
So what information have you actually got, and how is that going to be useful for the industry going forward?
So what we've got is a long-term data set from 12 sites, looking at the nitrogen and phosphorus losses over that period that the flux meters were in the ground collecting data. It's going to be it has been useful, and it is useful because it's actually the first data set that we've got on actual losses. So there's an opportunity to look at that data for ongoing scientific work that may be on the horizon. And some of the things that we know about it can be used to inform some of our crop models that are out there. So the data set has been supplied to Overseer to help them improve the crop module in Overseer. And that was always one of our intentions about what would happen to this data. But there are other crop models out there like APSIM, which it may also be used to, calibrate or validate those models. But from a practical point of view, we've been able to look at the data and see where the risk periods are on the farm, and have been able to go back to the farmers, the host farmers that is, and discuss changes that they may make to try and reduce the risk of losses. So it's an important data set.
When you talk about a drainage event, that's a big rainfall.
It's a big rainfall. Fortunately, it's not a big irrigation event. So that was one of the good things that came out of this data set. We found that our farmers are pretty efficient irrigators. Unless they were unlucky and it rained after they'd had their irrigator on, there was no drainage associated with irrigation, always associated with a big rainfall event.
And then, of course, it depends on when that rainfall event is and how much nitrogen's in the soil at that time anyway.
And we did, and this is no surprise, as we found drainage during the winter, and that relates to the fact that the soils become not waterlogged, but they're at field capacity. And so it doesn't take a big rainfall event to make drainage happen. Then it's just a winter activity, really. Yeah.
Were there any surprises?
Not really, no. And you could say after 7 years of hard work, that's an unusual result, but there weren't any surprises.
But now you've got real data that you can be used with, and rather than assumptions.
That's right, yeah.
So what's next with this sort of project?
Okay, one of the things, when I was looking at the data set to do my final reporting, we looked at when losses were occurring, and one of the things the data set showed us was that farmers are very, very good at matching the amount of nitrogen their crop's going to take off with the amount of fertilizer they add. What they're not so good at is understanding how much nitrogen the soil will supply. And that's only becomes a problem when nitrogen levels in the soil build up. So we've looked at mineral N levels during the course of the project, and we found that sometimes they started to get really high. And when I say really high, there was one farm we measured over 500 kilos of nitrogen sitting in the soil. Which really, really high. That's more than 2 crops can use. And that then becomes an environmental risk, because at each drainage event that nitrogen will start to move through the profile, and when it's gone beyond the root zone, it's gone. The roots aren't there to take it up. And in our current challenge of managing nitrogen for our freshwater management, but also because it's an economic loss to the farm, we need to be able to understand those environmental risks. And so what the project has shown is that we're going to have to get farmers up to speed with understanding the soil supply and managing it. And I'm not saying that we need to completely remove all our nitrogen in the soil. That's not what we need to do. We need to understand what to do when the levels get beyond probably about 150 kilos of nitrogen per hectare, because elephant grass might take it out, but probably none of our arable or vegetable crops. It's a lot.
So there's going to be some work underway to figure that out.
Hopefully. Well, we've got lots of tools to help farmers measure soil supply, and I'm guessing it's going to be quite a big extension effort to get farmers confident to be able to use less nitrogen than they think they perhaps need. It's just a little bit of cutting back.
Right. Well, thank you, Di. Now, assuming that the COVID gods look kindly on us, you're going to be down at ARIA on the Wednesday, the 24th of November, and you'll be covering some of this material again and available to answer any questions that people have at that stage as well.
That's correct. And I know that FAR's going to be doing quite a lot of extension work around nitrogen management in the next year or so. And this data set provides us with that evidence to support some of the things that we're saying, I guess, so that we've got that confidence to be able to discuss it with farmers. We do now have an actual data set of losses.
Thanks very much, Di, and thank you to all our listeners. Have a great day on the farm.
Thanks for tuning in to Cut the Crop, presented to you by FAR. If you'd like to know more about any of the topics discussed or have any suggestions for future topics, go to www.cutthecrop.co.nz.